we've talked about attitudes, we've talked previously and tonight about the relationship with the press. But fundamentally, what it was all about was the exercise of leadership and the focus on how does a president lead. Today, I want to look at it from the other side, not necessarily top down, and the behavior first and foremost from the perspective of what does the president want, but rather the bottom up, looking at this institution in terms, what does it mean for us in terms of representation, as well as how representing us, how that influences presidential behavior. So it's a little bit of a flip of what we've been talking about. But to start this conversation, we have to focus on, or we have to define what we mean by representation generally and what we mean by presidential representation and if it's different. And as we all know, the United States was founded on principles of a modern democracy, which blends majority rule to make with delegation to make representative government. And we call that a democracy, but it's not a real democracy. It's not like we have one person voting, every person voting on every single issue. And we like that it's not a true democracy. Can you imagine how time consuming it would be to actually be continuously involved in all the decisions that get made in this country? We're way too big. Even the smallest countries would have difficulty doing that. This way we get to have our own lives. And we do that by limiting our decisions to the selection of the government officials who act as our agents. They deliberate and commit the citizenry to collective enterprises. And building roads, going to war, big, small issues. That's what we hire people to do for us. But the Constitution provides us with the right to petition government and to participate in elections. And both those things give us a wealth of opportunities to have a say, to have influence on what government does. But there are challenges to real representation in this country. And those challenges come from who is heard and how are they heard. And it would come, I'm sure, as no surprise to anybody here that people with money have more opportunity to influence elected officials. Everybody has the right to vote in both primaries and general elections according to the rules of where they live. Everybody also has the right to donate to political candidates, to parties, and to interest groups. And the Supreme Court ruled that donation is equivalent to your political speech because it's an expression of your political preferences. And this makes sense from the perspective of you wouldn't give money to somebody you didn't want to see win, which is why money is often a very good barometer of the success of a campaign in the early days. And so those that can donate to candidates, elected officials, political parties, and interest groups. But of course, unlike voting, although everybody can donate, not everybody is able to donate. And so what this means is being financially able to do this gets you extra speech in our system. And that extra speech gets you connected to those who represent you in additional ways that people without money and that extra speech don't have. And voting still matters more because none of these things, this additional speech matters for politicians if those politicians are not in office. So turnout is always going to overcome money, but money is exceptionally powerful when the majority of people are not participating. So there are various levels then for us to understand the quality of our representation. And so when we think about political representation, we think about those connections to parties, to groups, and to elected officials. And representation through voting is the most overt way we feel that our interests are expressed. You vote for somebody who matches your desires, your wants, your needs. And, you know, I don't know anybody, maybe there are people out there who vote for people they don't want, but I would argue that anybody who bothers to vote is voting for somebody they want to actively represent them. And so that overt expression occurs local and state representatives, for our member of Congress, for our US senators. And this direct voting sets up a feedback loop. These officials, they have to pay attention to us because we keep them in office if we are happy, and we remove them if we are not. That's the whole purpose of elections. For House members who run every 2 years, this was the intent, to have that feedback loop. And as a result, House members have always been very responsive to their constituents, but only if their constituents are paying attention and expressing those interests in some manner. Senators, because it's up to us to hold members accountable. If we don't, then they don't really have to pay attention to us because nobody's challenging them on anything. So think about 2020 in terms of all the promises from the politicians who were running after the Black Lives Matter protests. If this mattered to you, well, then in 2022, you should be looking at those individuals and saying, okay, this is what you said in 2020 when your feet were to the fire, and people were pressing you. What are you going to do? Well, what did you do in this 2-year period? That's our job. That's what we do.
Amy. All right. Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Senators actually have it a lot easier in this scenario because, of course, they have 6-year terms. And so with a 6-year term, you get a much longer time to do something that your constituents don't like. So for example, if you think about the senators who voted to impeach, to convict President Trump, none of them are really significantly threatened by this decision because several of them are retiring. Republican Bill Cassidy of Louisiana had just been elected. And that gives them 6 years to either hope you forgot about it or gives you time to earn back goodwill with whatever you've done for your state. So the members of Congress, all the House, 1/3 of the Senate who are up in 2022 already view everything they're doing through the lens of that election that will be occurring, even though we literally just had one. People will often argue that doing anything to get reelected is a bad thing, but in political science, we call this their electoral connection. And the reason we consider it so important, and hopefully others do as well, is that it's the desire to be reelected that keeps us, pardon me, that keeps them accountable to us. And so if we are not paying attention, then all sorts of undesirable things can occur and have occurred. When we're blissfully ignoring government, That's when stuff happens that may not be in service of our citizens. So how does the presidency fit into all of this? As Jolie nicely pointed out before we got started, the mechanism for voting for the president is different than for the House and the Senate. The Constitution originally had staggered connections to the public. Eligible voters directly elected members of the House of Representatives. The Senate was indirectly elected by the public. We voted for the state legislature, who then selected our senators. And this, of course, was changed by constitutional amendment in Amendment 17 in 1913. The president, however, as we all know, is still not directly elected by the people. The Electoral College is a separate group selected by the state, and that appointment is determined by each state. And today, all the states except Maine and Nebraska use a winner-take-all system. The appointed electors vote for the winner of the popular vote in their state. And most states have laws requiring those electors to do this. And the Supreme Court has emphasized in Bush v. Gore in 2000 that, and they said, and I quote, "The individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the president of the United States." And so what this means is sort of what we're experiencing now. When it comes to presidential elections, the voters are at the mercy of the state legislatures, which is why it's also important to hold your state representatives accountable. And so we're seeing this in a variety of ways, how the state legislators control voting processes in each state, which is why we have 51 ways of doing things. And so there's tons of issues that we could discuss when it comes to representation, but I'm going to focus us on the presidency. And so the president is not directly elected. So then does the president still have that accountability feedback loop? Does the presidency have that electoral connection that holds the presidency accountable to us? Put another way, can the president do stuff we don't want the president to do? I would argue yes and no. And so how is it a yes? How is the presidency accountable to us? Well, first, the obvious is re-election, just like members of Congress. The presidency had the same feedback loop as members of Congress indirectly until 1951, when the 22nd Amendment limited the president to 2 consecutive terms. And so using the argument we made earlier about Congress and the electoral connection, the president only then has one opportunity for electoral accountability. So the first term under this thinking would be very much about representation. But the second term, we have to wonder about whether this actually works. So the bid for re-election, the desire to be re-elected, as with Congress, theoretically keeps the president attentive to his constituency. But we have to stop for a minute and think, what do we mean by constituency? So I'm going to share screen in a minute. Let me. Okay, can we see? We're good? Okay. So this is a model comparing the representation and the constituencies of both Congress and the presidency. And the congressional model is actually very old, comes from a scholar named Richard Fenno back in the 1970s. And he actually designed it in terms of concentric circles with the member of Congress in the middle and the relationship to the constituency moving outward. I actually find it's a little easier to present it this way if you're doing 2 of them. And so what's important to note here is what this is trying to show is how important different groups are to the elected official. And the arrow is showing us how these groups increase in importance to the member of Congress or to the president. So what's important to note then in this model is the least important grouping is the one designed by the Constitution, the geographic area that the member of Congress is supposed to represent. The closest, the most important, the most significant, the most able to hold the member accountable, of course, are friends and family. After that come early donors and voters. Then you have your re-election constituency, and then your geographic. The president is slightly different because, of course, first of all, the geographic area the president is responsible is the entirety of the US. But then there's also this issue factor and realigning the constituency of the presidency slightly differently. But still, the closest: friends, family, early donors, voters, and supporters. So in both cases, who matters the most? People who give you money. Who matters the least? The constitutionally defined geographic setup. So this way of thinking about constituency gives you your electoral coalition and a mechanism for monitoring accountability on both sides, for the president and for those groups that committed to the president. And so the collection of groups and individuals who voted for the president or member of Congress are easily identifiable. We know who these people are based on donations or by simply asking people, who did you vote for, through public opinion polling. And so we and the politician can identify, monitor, and track the continued support or loss of support as decisions are made by using public opinion polling. And as I said last time, we could have a whole other conversation about public opinion polling, but I'm going to assume for what I'm talking about today that we actually measure stuff with public opinion and that it's accurate. So think for a minute about Biden's electoral coalition. Who was it? Well, fundamentally, 2020 was an incumbent race. President Trump was running for re-election. So then Biden's coalition at its heart is whomever didn't want Donald Trump again. And President Biden actually ran on that, which most candidates don't do. He was really overt in sort of putting his hand up and saying, I am not Donald Trump, I am not going to be Donald Trump, and I'm not going to govern that way. So he was right out there in making that comparison easy for people in terms of, if you want that, fine. If you want different, this is your option. And if we drill down a little further, though, Biden's coalition was pretty broad, and it was a collection of Black, brown, white, young, old, rich, poor, suburban, urban, across a wide array of issues. Now, if you ask people who's the source of Biden's victory, pundits or people within the Democratic coalition, you'll get multiple answers. For example, from the progressive activists, they think they're responsible, particularly in states like Arizona and Georgia. Moderate Democrats point to the suburban voters outside of Atlanta, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Milwaukee. Still others will point to the large margins among the youth vote and among voters of color. So it was very broad, but it was also thin in that it didn't have a lot of depth. And that was because of the disaffected Republicans and independents. The question is, can President Biden hold those people through to a re-election? And so the White House, Biden's White House, is going to be monitoring these people. And, pundits and people like me are also paying attention to it. And this is what all the polling is often about for the next 4 years, monitoring and for the Biden White House, responding, being responsive to changes among these groups in order to hold on to them and also to bring more people in. And so that movement, that adjustment in response to unhappiness is what produces responsiveness. Now, normally, presidents actually want to move the public to their preferred position rather than adjust to where the public is. But that, in a sense, is kind of a negotiation. And that, too, is a measure of responsiveness and representation that we see between the president and the public, his constituency, as opposed to with members of Congress. So this is how accountability works in the presidency. You assemble an electoral coalition, you run on it, you gather that support, and then you have to create a governing coalition out of your electoral one based on those in DC and the people who are participating in this, rather than the combination of inside and outside that gets you the victory. So how the president then maintains and tries to expand this initial electoral coalition is really the key to accountability for him and for us. Now, this brings us interestingly to Donald Trump and his notoriously narrow coalition or constituency, but surprisingly deep electoral coalition strategy that was unexpected for a lot of people. If you look back to FDR, the majority of our presidents since then, and since the amendment, have been two-term presidents. So clearly there's an incumbency advantage to being president, just like there's an incumbency advantage for House members and senators. And if you think about it, we know what that is. There's name recognition simply because you're president. There's the Rose Garden strategy where that's the term we use for the fact that every event at the White House, every effort to act as president is sort of a free opportunity to showcase that you're good at it. So it's like free advertising. And the president is also running on that 4-year record, the idea of promises kept. And interestingly, the majority of presidents keep their promises. If you go through, what they've tried to do, how much credit they get for it is a different question. But on top of that, the economy fluctuates, the situations that occur on the world stage, health crises, domestic challenges, all offer the potential for turmoil and obviously challenge for re-election. So if you think about these presidents, Truman served almost 2 terms, but chose not to run again, even though he was exempt from the 22nd Amendment. Kennedy, of course, was assassinated. Ford never won any election, though he didn't win the first time. He was, he took over for Richard Nixon. And so he didn't lose re-election. He lost actually his first election. So the only ones we have in the modern era who ran for a second term but did not win: Carter, George H.W. Bush, and now Donald Trump. And I really want to look at doing more research and writing on this. But what's notable about this was Trump's intentional strategy to double down on his narrow but apparently deep electoral coalition. So if Biden was the not Trump candidate, Trump as the incumbent clearly had to run on his record. And so for 3 years, pundits and scholars, have watched Trump's strategy and have speculated on whether or not this was going to work. And so if you think about, well, who was that coalition in 2016? It was primarily white working class voters, men and women. And this conservative yet populist bloc was pretty durable. He also had evangelical support. Interestingly, if you compare who voted for him with who voted for Romney in 2012, it really wasn't all that different. And some have argued that his approach and strategy was all about maximizing that electoral advantage Republicans have in those rural, unpopulous states. So, but that really gets us to this third point about, is the presidency representative? And that's about the party and the role of the party in presidential behavior. And if 2020 shows us anything, it's that party polarization and commitment among active people is really quite significant. And this keeps the president's agenda committed to the party's agenda. Although you could argue that that didn't really happen in Trump's case, in that some of his agenda was very much the standard Republican agenda, with these sort of additional things thrown in that Republicans had never really pushed for, indicating the strength and power of this new vocal constituency that Trump basically revealed to the world in 2016. Now, normally when you're president and each branch of government is dominated by that one party, the president's party, meaning unified rather than divided government, you can get significant legislation, the kind that can be transformational rather than transactional. Think about Obamacare. Or civil rights legislation in the 60s. The party politics enable that kind of representation. And the parties know that it's easier to get things done legislatively or even unilaterally if you hold the presidency and Congress. And that's why they fight so hard to achieve it. So all of these ways put pressure on the president to conform to what do each of these factors of your constituency want. But it gets us also to this side of the question of where I'm saying, well, no, maybe they're not all that accountable to us. And sort of takes us into this question of how representation at the presidential level works and is different than with Congress. And so the presidency is a totally different animal in terms of elected official because of how the president is elected. It's the only official on the ballot for everyone at the same time on the same day. This is obvious. And it's what makes the president a national figure. Congress is a national institution, but it gets there by adding together the 435 districts in the House and the 100 seats representing the 50 states in the Senate. That is not the same thing as everybody voting and choosing between the same candidates on the same day. And so this national ballot, even with the Electoral College, which counts by state, plus the national attention from the campaign, is what gives the president the ability to claim a national audience and a national mandate through victory. And that's where I think we start getting into different questions about representation, because that victory, the amount that presidents win by, then becomes this different measure of constituency. And I argue in my previous book, The Presidential Roadshow, that this national connection is important in two different ways. The number of people, meaning the size of the electoral college vote and the popular vote, shapes the strength and health of that electoral coalition, which in turn shapes governing coalition. Now, some of this is going to seem like obvious. Well, of course, if the president wins bigger, they're more likely to be successful. But when and where and what does that do to presidential leadership? And I argued in this book that if you have a large electoral college victory and a large popular vote total, that's the president who thinks of us in that geographic term, in that one nation focus. And so if you then are trying to use the public to achieve your agenda, there's a much tighter connection between the idea of representing all because of how many people actually put you there. It's very different when you have an electoral coalition that's smaller and more fragmented because of what that says about the strength of your connection to the national single audience, the one thing that the president can rely on that nobody else has. So if you think about presidents like George W. Bush and how he came into office, and then Donald Trump, they had narrow electoral college victories. Obviously, George W. Bush's was like non-existent. It was a tie virtually. Trump's is a little bigger. It was comfortable. 306 electoral college votes, about 57% of the votes. But both George W. Bush and Trump lost the popular vote. And so then if without that popular support, how can you claim to represent a national audience? I argued that that mechanism, that electoral constituency that you have and the size of it influences the kind of leadership you exercise, because it influences the way in which presidents think about us. And so, and I used this, I measured this by identifying something I called the presidential voice as a way of coming up with a mechanism to a variable to measure this. And what I did was I looked at all the speeches that presidents give when traveling around the country, as well as from the Oval Office. And what that allowed me to do, I have this neat little software program called Diction that a friend of mine down at Texas created. And it measures rhetorical tone. So not the content of your speech, but the tenor, the tone, the approach. And I use tone as a measure of voice. And so by comparing what the tone was when you gave a presidential Oval Office address with the speech that you gave at the Iowa State Fair, you can determine whether or not there was a difference. And by comparing all presidents' national speeches and all their local speeches, I was able to identify what I called the national presidential voice. And so Obama, for example, who came into office with 65% electoral college victory and a really healthy popular vote, he had one voice. Whether he was at the Iowa State Fair or in the Oval Office, he used the same rhetorical tone. In contrast, George W. Bush had two. He had the national voice, the presidential voice, the voice he used in the Oval Office. And then when he traveled around local places, he was attempting to exercise a form of constituency leadership and needed a different rhetorical style, a different approach. And so this second voice was all about trying to make up for the fact that didn't win with a comfortable majority of the nation. So when I looked at Trump in my most recent book, and this was one of the things that I wanted to look at because of the way in which he was exercising public leadership, I found that Trump didn't have two voices. He actually had three. And this probably would not surprise you to find out that where his national addresses were not all that different from other presidents and their national addresses, indicating this idea that when you're in the Oval Office, you know you're speaking to the nation. It also indicates that when you're speaking from the Oval Office, somebody's helping you write your speech, and that speech writers have, the institution of the White House, the institution of speech writing adds a similarity across presidents that we've come to expect. So because Trump's coalition was fragile, he too traveled around the country, basically riling up and trying to get his supporters to pressure Congress to do what he wanted and gain support that he didn't get through the Electoral College. So those are the two voices we'd seen before. What's the third voice? Twitter. Nobody's surprised to hear this. But what's really interesting is the fact that using the software program, I can identify that Trump's Twitter speech was different than his local speech, which was different from his national speech. Now, all that's interesting, and you can have that, focus on the actual rhetoric and all of that, but it also tells us something about President Trump's audience, who he thought his audience was, and that with three different audiences, he clearly wasn't spending a lot of time thinking about being president in his public rhetoric for all, in that wasn't the kind of language and leadership he was exercising. And so you can argue that these three different voices, three different audiences, meant that President Trump viewed his constituency much more similarly to the way members of Congress do than we're accustomed to thinking presidents do. In that we have this whole mythos that, president for all, president for the nation, national figure. And yet, how much of presidential governing in recent years is sliding away from this national model into this more kind of parochial model? And this isn't necessarily a problem in terms of representation, but what it really points to is that what the purpose of having a single unified voice is to add that voice to the locally or state focused voices that are in Congress. The president, as this national figure, has this ability to center attention and center the congressional agenda on what the nation may need. But what the behavior, what the rhetoric is showing us is that presidents are thinking about the nation as a whole less and less, and instead thinking more about these subsets that make up their electoral coalition. Now,
Diane, can I just ask a question quickly?
Sure.
Because I thought Trump was the first president in my lifetime that ever presented himself as not the president for all the people. Like, he was constantly attacking states that didn't support him, saying blue states, and these are blue state bailouts, and and he punished blue states, right? Wasn't that the first time this has ever happened? So when you say it's not really a problem that they're doing this, it's a huge problem, because he normalized something that had never been accepted. It's like the president's supposed to be the president for all the people, whether you agree with his policies or not.
Well, we don't know that it's been normalized, right? The only way we'll be able to say that is the subsequent presidents. If they do his behavior, well, then yes, it's become normalized. But if they're not doing it, then it's kind of a one-off. It's not as significant. But I would push back a little bit on this idea that he was the first one to do it. What he was the first one to do, as with everything else, was to do it so overtly and to be so in your face about it. No other president was doing that. And some of that is simply the language he uses rather than the actual behavior. But in terms of representation, clearly people felt that. So if the presidency is intended to serve not just, as sort of a legislative figure, directing Congress and indicating where Congress should go, which is sort of how we think about our campaigns now, is that, we fight for an entire year to see who wins as a way of giving direction for the next 2 or 4 years. But symbolically, there is also this idea of we are one nation. And whether people believed it really or not before Trump, it was never so divisive until he arrived. I mean, it was so much more under the undercover. I mean, when they talk about dog whistles, right, that, the Republicans using racially charged language, it was always racially charged. It wasn't racist, right? There's a difference in how you do it. And so, Trump's behavior, his language, his approach, his tweeting was obviously very, very different and something we had never, seen before in the presidency. But I would not go so far as to say that he's fundamentally unique in this desire to chop up the country into groupings that serve re-election. So that's where I think the difference is, in that they've gotten more and more not congressional, but this sort of slicing and dicing of their constituency. But most previous presidents papered over that with their national speech. And that's what, and in particular, the idea of being the empathizer in chief, the sympathizer in chief, that one of the things the president does is mourn and go and comfort and offer support. And that was something that Trump, either couldn't or wouldn't or didn't want to do. And so when you pull that out of presidential leadership, you lose that unifying component that we expect. And that, if you think about Joe Biden, that's exactly what he's doing. I mean, he's gone so far the other way. It's almost like, whiplash, in that, his approach to leadership is already clearly vastly different from President Trump's. So it's really going to be this interesting question: how much of Trump's choices and behaviors survive these 4 years of the Biden administration? And I think 2024, you can invite me back and we can talk about this. Okay, somebody's echoing. Who is not muted? Okay, there we go. So that's one of the weird Zoom things. Like, I'm hearing it back myself, which is, odd. So when we think about Biden and Trump on this idea of national leadership or a national constituency and representing the nation, Biden's all in, right? He is so old school in this idea of the president as a national leader. And, what's interesting is, from my argument, Biden comes into office with the same number of electoral college votes as Trump had in 2016, 306, which again is a respectable 57%. But Trump was hounded by the fact that he lost the popular vote, whereas Biden clearly won it, and won it significantly. The other side of this, which I'm actually also somewhat intrigued about in terms of understanding where we are with presidential leadership, is that Biden is really focusing in on the fact that national representation and this national constituency isn't about the president's behavior or Congress's behavior. It's about the public's responsiveness. And, you know, the language that everybody in Congress and in the press is using is bipartisan, but I think you could sort of slide in this idea of national and representative. And that Biden is arguing is that it's not the fact that the COVID relief bill had no Republican support. Biden's arguing that this is still representative and still national and bipartisan because he has public support for this. And that's why he keeps focusing on it. So I'm going to show you a quick slide to support this. I don't mind going over if we need to, because we got a little bit late start. And so if you look at some of the data, this is from Pew, which is a lovely nonpartisan public opinion organization. And this is about the support for the COVID relief bill. 70% of the country favors this huge COVID relief bill. You know, when was the last time 70% of Americans agreed on anything other than the fact that chocolate is good? You know, I mean, we don't. So, and if you think about it, here's the significant number. It's not that 94% support what Biden, 94% of Democrats support what Biden said. It's the fact that 41% of Republicans do. So, you know, it's not the majority of Republicans, but 41, that's really quite good. That's quite healthy. And that's what gives you, plus independents, this 70% number. And so what it says is these numbers support Biden's message that regardless of what the Republicans in the Senate are doing, the public is more united than divided. And it's going to be really interesting if this message is sustainable and whether this message, in a sense, heals the divisions that we've seen, but also brings the presidency back to its traditional role of representing the nation as a whole. And if you look at this next slide, and this is about the behavior. And so about who made a good faith effort. And so do you think the Biden administration made a good faith effort to work with Republicans? So the numbers are smaller here. And this reflects more partisanship because you see the numbers with Republicans go down. But also the numbers of Democrats who think they made a good faith effort to be bipartisan also went down. But what about the reverse? Do you think the Republicans made a good faith effort? Democrats say no, but the majority also say no. And the number of Republicans who think their own people made a good faith effort is smaller than the number who say Biden didn't. So there are Republicans who are supportive of Biden, in addition to independents, in addition to Democrats. And this is more of what we are used to when we say that there is a national thing. It's never going to be 100%, but like 65% of the nation in support of something is pretty good. And even more interesting then is also what Trump's core. Remember who he said his constituency, who he said his constituency was. Lower income Republicans support the bill because, of course, it's much needed aid. And, you know, how much does partisanship hold up in the face of needing help? And that's what this bill really pushes back on and reflects the potential weakening of that really intense core that Trump hung on to, that without the figurehead, it's going to soften, which in turn expands opportunity for President Biden. And so everything in this data supports the Biden argument about national leadership. This comfortable majority supports the idea that the public is buying into Biden's performance. He's getting a legitimate honeymoon, which we did not see with Trump. Oh, I'm going to skip that. So this is President Biden's approval rating. 53.7% of the nation approve. That's nice and comfortable and healthy. So what did Trump and Obama look like on the same day? So Biden on day 76 is at 53%. Trump was at 40%. So by 75 days, his approval rating was already set in stone. And it really reflected the popular vote disturbance that the election of 2016 demonstrated. Obama comes in with a much larger victory. And so his approval rating numbers, not surprisingly, are higher. And so what this tells us is how important we are to the presidency in terms of the president being able to get things done. But it also reflects how the president can be important to us for things beyond just transactional, what bill passed. And I think that when we think about representation and we think about accountability, it's important that we participate, and these polls help us to signal how we feel about what's current, and that helps to have produce balance and to produce, I would argue, a measure of calm. And so ideally, this is where we're heading. I think there's a lot more that I can say here, but I wanted to take some questions, if any had. I think Jolie had a couple. I'm not sure if I answered them.
I think you answered my big question, which was exactly that about the, I would add in that I've been thinking a lot about corporate speech and the effect that has lately, especially because of the reaction McConnell spoke about with respect to how dare these companies have an opinion that they should be non-political. At the same time that they supported Citizens United, they said, yes, let the corporate people pour in. So it's a very interesting disconnect that has a real effect, though, on what's going to happen politically.
Yeah, I think there's a real problem, though, in relying on corporations to, in a sense, put a supply-demand consumer approach to things, in the sense of that, sure, businesses are not going to do things that are going to offend their customers, but they don't always do that. But it is very interesting to see where the corporations are going. You know, one of the fabulous ways you can see this is with commercials, and how you know, you see people of color in commercials so much more. You see mixed marriages in commercials. There was even a car commercial that had a divorce, that you had, each of them had I think it was a Subaru, and they were meeting to exchange the kid. And, you know, it's like, this is 30 seconds. And they've clearly demonstrated that this is what what they're comfortable with. But then on the other hand, there was this huge outcry a couple of years ago about the Cheerio commercial with with a biracial couple and a biracial girl. So you never know what's going to go berserk in terms of, and what corporations are gonna have to respond to. But what was really fascinating in Atlanta is the fact that, or in Georgia, is that the Georgia legislature threatened to take away Delta's corporate tax break and a couple of other things, which, if we started to see corporations not giving money and not supporting through interest group donations and things like that, I think we would see different behavior. So on the one hand, it's a good thing, I think, about corporate responsibility, but it's really difficult to rely on. Now, Mitch McConnell's hypocrisy, I think, is a totally different conversation, right? I mean, it shouldn't surprise anybody that that McConnell is saying that corporations shouldn't be involved, whereas 20 minutes ago they're helping design legislation. So I wouldn't pay too much attention to that.
I don't.
So if presidential power is so influenced by the national constituency, as you suggest, how then does a president like Biden push his legislative plan forward with the situation we have in the Senate?
Well, theoretically, the way the mechanism has worked in the past is that by appealing to the public and by sort of marketing what the president wants to do, this is going to in turn pressure members of Congress to vote for what the president wants because their constituency wants it. The problem with that, of course, is we have these districts that are so clearly one way or the other that often you need then a big surge of support for a president to get a member of Congress to be willing to compromise. I mean, we all, if you remember back in the 80s, it was just a very different way of working on legislation, and that legislation was actually desired. The current crop of Republicans, you really can question just at that base level, do they want government to do things? And in a lot of cases, the answer is no, they want government to do less. So it means there's a lot less incentive for doing anything, even if their own constituents want it. Now, that's one of the reasons why I showed you that slide about what lower income white rural Americans think, is because, this is sort of the same reason why the Republicans fought so hard on Obamacare, is that once you give people help and you show that government functions, well, then there's support for that. And I think one of the things that's so important that Biden is doing is showing people that government can do the job. I mean, it's never going to be easy. I mean, at the same time that COVID rollout of the vaccine is going well, there's another mess at the border. So, it's balancing that. But theoretically, if 70% of the public is happy with the Biden plan, this should have an impact on members of Congress. Although amusingly, you might have seen this on cable or in social media feeds, that there's I think it was a Texas Republican who voted against COVID relief bill and then was pointing out to his constituents how they could take advantage of what's in the bill that he didn't want to give them. So, if you have constituents who then aren't paying careful attention and maybe didn't know he didn't vote for it, suddenly maybe they're giving him credit where credit is clearly not due. So, some of this is on us. How much are we paying attention? And in 2019, I guess mostly 2020, we were really paying attention to things. And this focus on police violence and racial inequity, if that, how does that, what happens with that? Did people get all riled up and then that disappears? I think that's going to be very telling and very important for what happens next. But I also don't think compromise is a dirty word. I don't think Biden has to get everything that he wants. I don't think that just because the Democrats voted HR 1 and are pushing this forward, they don't have to get everything in HR 1. The Senate needs to do its job, weigh in, and we get a compromised bill out of that. And I actually really think that this is what Biden is pushing as well. I think he wants to return to that view of government and government responsibility. Mitch McConnell makes it very difficult because he does not view the Senate's role in that way and his party's role in that way. So it's going to be very interesting moving forward. But right now, the public is on Biden's side, and they will likely attempt to ride that to get more of what they want. And so we'll see if it's effective. Any other questions?
Well, I had a question.
Go ahead.
Okay. Isn't it well, I start from the proposition that, and I think this is accurate, Romney got a higher percentage of the popular vote in 2012 than Trump got in 2016.
Yep.
Okay, that's number one. So Trump was not elected nationally. If we had national election, he would have lost. And I would suggest that the entire attitude that he exhibited during the entire presidency was a function of that. And Biden comes in with a very different situation because he did get a majority. He not only won the popular vote, he won more than 50% of the popular vote. I think he got like 51%. So he is, he can look at himself as a national president because he is. And I think that the Democrats in the bill that you highlighted in all those figures, the really telling figure I would suggest is the one that you focused on, which was the lower income rural white voters really supporting that. And I would ask you if the following is accurate. The Democrats seem to have ignored the white working class for a long time because of the focus on other groups and the prioritization of messaging about other groups. A lot of what they actually did was beneficial to white, poorer, or working class voters, but they haven't made that clear. And this bill and the infrastructure bill may be the beginning of making that clear. Is that an accurate assessment?
I do not disagree that the Democrats have been very ineffective at indicating their support for the poor, the working poor, white rural voter. And I think that Biden has a legitimacy here that other leading Democratic figures have not had. And I think the emphasis, particularly on coastal Democrats, East or West, has encouraged them to forget about the middle. But I think we also have to acknowledge that the heart of the Democratic Party are in city. And so cities have very different needs, desires, and influences than rural voters do. And so what has been the, sort of fight has been that suburban middle, which the Democrats won this time. But I agree with you in the sense of, where and how the Democrats lost the union vote has been really interesting. And it traces a lot to competing issues. Sort of this sense, and a lot of political scientists who are economically focused pay a lot of attention to this idea of rational choice voting, that you choose based on your economic self-interest. The problem is not everybody does that. And one of the most interesting perspectives to me was with George W. Bush, and how he won Southern white working males, some of whom were union voters, also in Ohio. And it was because they were prioritizing his compassionate Christianity, that voice spoke to these individuals in a way that the union message wasn't, that was where the connection was being made, even though his economic message would directly impact them and in fact harm them should Bush have been successful. It was very unexpected and unusual. And it wasn't necessarily charisma, right? I mean, we remember George W. Bush, not hugely charismatic on a national stage, although reportedly in person, very effective. But there was something about, George W. Bush really brought his religious belief into his leadership, and that worked on groups that normally would not have been, sort of in his coalition. So I think the Democrats had lost over time in a number of ways, some of which are about communication, some of which are about preferences and choices. And so can that be fixed? Maybe. And again, Biden is a really powerful choice to do that because of the way in which he goes about his leadership style. And so, when we think about why he won, and, voters in South Carolina choosing him over, all much more progressive voters, perhaps it's this understanding of this more universal appeal of Biden, which all the so-called pundits, experts, consultants, totally overlooked and said was not what was needed in this race, and yet turned out to be quite effective.
Anna, do you have something else you want to say?
Diane, you've given us so much to think about yet again, as you always do. We want to thank you for your time and your expertise. I don't know if there are any last comments or questions before we let Diane get probably a well-needed cup of tea or cup of water. But really, yes, thank you so much. I mean, it's, as I always say to you, my head is always spinning at the end of these sessions. I have so many things that I'm thinking about in a new way. So thank you so much for your generosity and your expertise. And we're just so grateful to have you as a teacher and congregant. Sorry, I came in a little late. I was getting my second vaccination. So definitely for a good reason.
We're happy about that.
Thank you.
But I thank you all for attending and listening. And anytime that you want to hear on a particular topic, just ask. I'm here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much,
Thanks
Diane.
everyone for being here
everybody.
tonight.
Great series.
Thank you.
Give my best to Owen.
Thanks so much.
Bye,
Good night, everybody.
Thanks
Be
so much for
well.
joining us.
Stay healthy and well. Thank you so much.
I did like Dickie having this moment with his father, as twisted as it was.
I figured that was okay, right? To like jump in there.
No, I'm glad that you did. Absolutely. That was nice.
So
Oh my
how did it,
God.
how was the beginning? How was it? I mean, it was like, that was a good, it's always nice to have more, but that felt like a respectable amount of people. You know, she just does so much.
Yeah,
There
it's
was a little bit of redundancy, I thought, with the